pages 1 and 2 are done in my package, it's time for disassembly. We're going to just start with the outer parts of the engine and work our way inward. Mostly everything will come apart from here. The one thing for sure to leave in one piece, do not take the carburetor apart. We're going to leave those together for right now and worry about that later. So as I tear apart, I'm going to start with what I can see first, such as gas tank, the recoil shroud cover, the intake, air filter, the carburetor, the cylinder head, the exhaust, and then I'm going to work towards the innards of the engine. As I disassemble this engine, I want to plan ahead, think about when I had to put this back together. I want to help my future self so I have an easier time putting this engine back together. A few keys I have to help you be more successful is the use of Ziploc baggies and a Sharpie. As I pull bolts out, whether it's from the cylinder head or the crankcase cover, I'll put them in a baggie, write the name on them, put them in my locker. They'll be right there when I need them put this engine back together, and I'm not confused where the bolts go. Another thing I'll do is I'll take my cell phone. There's a lot of linkages and springs and wires, so I'll take my cell phone and I'll take pictures as I go, so I have those reference images when I need to put this back together. I'll also sometimes draw a diagram. The example of this is with the cylinder heads. The cylinder head has some bolts that are longer than others, so as I take out the bolts, I'll draw a quick diagram on my piece of paper, and I'll write an L for where the long ones came out and an S for the short ones, so when I go back together, I don't accidentally damage my engine. The last trick I have for you is as I take out bolts, like earlier I took off this plastic cover, I put the screws right back in where they came out of. Then when I go back together, I know exactly where they came from and where to put them back. So those are a few tips to help you organize better. So when we put these back together later on this semester, it's a lot easier on you. One of the questions on the packet is, what is damaged, what is broken, what is missing? As I disassemble this engine, I'm going to keep a list going. I might not fully fill it out today on my first day of working on this engine, but as I go, I'm going to make notes. I had a cover bolt broken. I have a screw missing from the intake. I have a cylinder head bolt that's stripped. I'm going to make notes of that so when I get done taking it apart, I can plan what parts I need to buy. I can plan what I have to fix. So when I put this back together, I have a lot easier time. A couple of reminders as we tear apart our engines. Make sure you're organizing as you go. Make sure you're using the right tool for the right job. Remember, we want that Goldilocks fit. We don't want a fit that's too big or too small. We want that perfect fit for the tool. And we want to make sure that if we're using impact tools, that we're using impact sockets. As I disassemble this engine, there's not any certain order I'm taking the components off in. I am just looking at what I can get access to and working from the outside in. As I take components off, you can notice that I'm checking them and seeing if they're good or bad and making notes of them on my packet. This will really help when we order parts. You'll have a list of things you know for sure that you need to purchase. So keep track of any bad or broken components as we tear apart this engine. Here's an example of me putting the bolts back in from where I took them out of, so when I had to put this engine back together, I have an easier time knowing what bolt came from where. Several of the exhausts have anti-rattle clips to keep the bolts from backing out as the engine's running. Just take a punch, a hammer, flatten those out, and then you can easily take those bolts out. When unloosening your cylinder head, make sure you do not go in a circle pattern because this could warp the head. Make sure you go in an X pattern or start from the center and work your way out, so that way you don't accidentally warp and damage your head. Remember, as you're taking your cylinder head bolts out, to pay attention to the length of the bolts. Some engines use different size lengths for the different holes, so make sure you're making a diagram and marking where the longer bolts go if you have longer ones. My engine still had the blade adapter on the PTO shaft, so I had to remove that so I could get the crankcase cover off the engine. The next step you'll need to do is remove the flywheel. There's several different ways to take the flywheel off, but I'm going to show you a couple of tricks that I used at the shop to get them off really quick and easily. When using an impact to take off the flywheel nut, make sure your fingers are not in the fins of the flywheel in case it catches and starts to spin. We do not want any broken fingers. To get the actual flywheel off the engine, you'll need 2 partners, 2 pry bars, a big punch, and a hammer. A couple of good hits on the end of the PTO shaft, and the flywheel will pop off. Just like that. The next component we'll take off is the crankcase cover, also sometimes known as the sump cover. When loosening these bolts, you need to go in an X pattern again, just like the cylinder head, so we don't accidentally cause damage. If your crankcase cover doesn't want to easily slide past the PTO shaft of your engine, you might have to take sandpaper to remove the rust on the PTO shaft. Now you'll remove the camshaft and tappets. The easiest way to get the camshaft out is to line up the timing marks. This is because it will take the pressure off the cam lobes and tappets. Before disconnecting the connecting rod from the crankshaft, we want to mark the piston head and the connecting rod to make sure we know what way it came apart, because this will help us with reassembly. If the piston and connecting rod are installed improperly, this can cause the engine to seize. With your piston and connecting rod now marked, you will unbolt the connecting rod from the crankshaft. While removing the connecting rod cap, I'm inspecting the bearings to see if there's any internal damage to the bearings or journals. Because this lawnmower engine has a few miles on it, there's a slight carbon buildup at the top of the cylinder bore. I simply take a little bit of sandpaper, sand it off, and the piston will slide out. Your last step for disassembly is to use our part washer and clean up your parts so that they're nice and clean when we go to measure them.